Marcus stared at his reflection in the bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the man looking back at him. Dark circles hung beneath his eyes like bruises, and his shoulders sagged under an invisible weight that seemed to grow heavier each day. At 32, he felt like he had already lived several lifetimes of disappointment. His latest business venture had crumbled 3 months ago, taking with it not just his savings, but also the respect of investors who had once believed in his vision. His girlfriend Sarah had moved out the week before, claiming she couldn't watch him self-destruct anymore. The apartment felt cavernous without her presence. Empty pizza boxes littered the coffee table, and unpaid bills created small mountains on his desk. Marcus had always prided himself on being the guy who had it all figured out, the one friends came to for advice, the eternal optimist who saw opportunity in every setback. But now, that version of himself felt like a stranger from another life. He picked up his phone and scrolled through LinkedIn, watching former colleagues celebrate promotions and new ventures while he remained stuck in what felt like quicksand. Every rejection email from potential employers felt like another nail in the coffin of his self-confidence. The financial pressure was mounting daily, and his emergency fund had dwindled to almost nothing. That evening, while aimlessly browsing a used bookstore downtown, Marcus stumbled upon a worn copy of Niccolo Machiavelli's The Prince. He had heard about it in college but never actually read it, assuming it was just some dusty political theory that had no relevance to modern life. The elderly bookstore owner, noticing Marcus's interest, approached with a knowing smile. "That book changed my life," the man said quietly, his weathered hands adjusting his glasses. "I was about your age when I first read it. Lost my job, lost my wife, thought I was finished. But Machiavelli taught me something crucial, that we have far more control over our circumstances than we realize. Most people read it as a guide for politicians, but it's really a manual for anyone who wants to take charge of their life." The old man's words resonated deeply with Marcus. He purchased the book for $5 and spent the entire night reading it cover to cover. As dawn broke through his apartment windows, something had shifted inside him. The text wasn't just about political maneuvering. It was about understanding human nature, strategic thinking, and most importantly, taking personal responsibility for one's circumstances. Machiavelli wrote about the concept of virtue, not virtue in the moral sense, but a combination of strength, skill, and adaptability that allows a person to shape their destiny rather than be shaped by it. He spoke of the importance of being both the lion and the fox, powerful when strength was needed, cunning when intelligence was required. Marcus realized he had been approaching his problems all wrong. He had been reactive instead of strategic, emotional instead of calculated, hopping for luck instead of creating opportunities. He had been waiting for circumstances to improve rather than actively working to improve them. The next morning, Marcus made a decision that would alter the trajectory of his entire life. He would completely rebuild himself using Machiavellian principles, not to become manipulative or unethical, but to develop the strategic mindset and emotional resilience that successful people possess. He would learn to think several steps ahead, to control his emotions rather than be controlled by them, and to view every setback as data rather than defeat. He started by analyzing his recent failures with brutal honesty. His last business had failed not because of market conditions or bad luck, but because he had been naive about human nature. He had trusted the wrong people, ignored red flags, and let emotions cloud his judgment. His relationship with Sarah had deteriorated because he had become needy and dependent rather than maintaining the confident independence that had attracted her in the first place. Marcus created what he called his Reforge protocol, a systematic approach to rebuilding himself into someone tougher, calmer, and more calculated. He would study not just Machiavelli, but also psychology, negotiation theory, and the biographies of people who had overcome seemingly impossible odds. The transformation wouldn't be easy or quick. It would require him to question everything he thought he knew about himself and develop entirely new habits and ways of thinking. But for the first time in months, Marcus felt a spark of genuine excitement. He wasn't just going to survive this rough patch. He was going to emerge from it stronger than he had ever been before. That first week, Marcus began implementing small but significant changes. He started each day by writing in a journal, analyzing the previous day's decisions and interactions through a strategic lens. He began reading for at least 2 hours daily, focusing on books about psychology, influence, and strategic thinking. He also started a rigorous exercise routine, understanding that physical strength would support mental resilience. Most importantly, he began practicing emotional detachment from outcomes while maintaining complete commitment to the process. When a potential employer didn't call back, instead of spiraling into self-doubt, he analyzed what he could learn from the interaction and immediately moved on to the next opportunity. The old Marcus would have been devastated by rejection. The new Marcus was beginning to see rejection as simply information, data points that would help him refine his approach. This shift in perspective was subtle but profound, and it marked the beginning of a transformation that would reshape not just his external circumstances, but his entire way of being in the world. 3 weeks into his transformation, Marcus encountered his first real test. David Chen, a former business partner who had pulled out of their failed venture at the last minute, called unexpectedly. David had heard through mutual connections that Marcus was struggling financially and wanted to meet for coffee. The old Marcus would have jumped at the chance, grateful for any human connection and hoping David might offer help or another opportunity. Instead, Marcus paused and considered the situation strategically. Why would David reach out now, after months of silence? What did he want, and what were his real motivations? Marcus had learned from Machiavelli that people rarely act without self-interest, and understanding those interests was crucial for any interaction. During their meeting at a downtown cafe, David's true agenda became clear. He had started a new company and needed someone with Marcus's technical skills, but he wanted to offer far below market rate because of Marcus's current situation. The old Marcus might have accepted out of desperation or gratitude, but Marcus now understood that desperation was a position of weakness, and Machiavelli had taught him that negotiating from weakness was a recipe for exploitation. Marcus listened carefully, asked thoughtful questions, and thanked David for thinking of him. Then he did something that surprised them both. He declined the offer politely but firmly, explaining that he was exploring several opportunities and would need time to consider all options. This wasn't entirely true. Marcus had no other concrete offers, but he understood that perceived value was often more important than actual value, and appearing too eager would only weaken his position. David's demeanor shifted immediately. Suddenly, the offer became more negotiable. The salary could be discussed, the equity percentage might be adjusted. Marcus recognized this as a crucial lesson in human psychology. People value what seems scarce and devalue what seems desperate. He scheduled a follow-up meeting for the following week, giving himself time to research David's new company and potentially create other options. That evening, Marcus applied another Machiavellian principle, the importance of building alliances before you need them. He spent hours reaching out to old contacts, not asking for favors, but simply reconnecting and offering value where possible. He shared interesting articles with former colleagues, made introductions between people in his network, and gradually began rebuilding his professional relationships. This approach yielded unexpected results. Within days, Marcus received 2 informal inquiries about consulting opportunities. Neither was perfect, but they provided leverage and options. More importantly, they restored his confidence in his ability to create opportunities rather than simply wait for them. Meanwhile, Marcus continued his daily study regimen. He dove deep into psychological principles, particularly those related to influence and persuasion. He learned about cognitive biases that affected decision-making, understanding how people could be influenced not through manipulation, but through presenting information in ways that aligned with natural psychological tendencies. He also began studying successful people who had overcome significant setbacks. He read biographies of entrepreneurs who had failed multiple times before achieving success, politicians who had lost elections before winning, and athletes who had recovered from career-threatening injuries. A pattern emerged. They all shared certain characteristics that Marcus began to cultivate in himself. They were patient but persistent, thinking in long-term timelines rather than seeking immediate gratification. They were emotionally resilient, able to absorb setbacks without being derailed by them. Most importantly, they were strategic thinkers who could separate their emotions from their decisions. Marcus began applying this strategic thinking to every aspect of his life. When his landlord raised his rent, instead of panicking or arguing, Marcus researched comparable properties, analyzed his options, and negotiated from a position of knowledge rather than emotion. When Sarah texted him late one night, clearly having second thoughts about their breakup, Marcus resisted the urge to respond immediately. Instead, he considered what he really wanted from the interaction, and whether re-engaging would move him toward his long-term goals. The physical transformation was equally important. Marcus's morning routine now included an hour of intense exercise, which he found not only improved his physical condition, but also enhanced his mental clarity and emotional stability. The discipline required for consistent physical training carried over into other areas of his life. He also began paying careful attention to his appearance and presentation. Machiavelli had written about the importance of perception in leadership, and Marcus understood that how others perceived him would significantly impact his opportunities. He invested in a few high-quality clothes, improved his grooming routine, and practiced confident body language. These changes weren't superficial vanity. They were strategic investments in his personal brand. When he walked into David's office for their follow-up meeting, Marcus carried himself differently. He was calm, prepared, and confident. He had researched David's company thoroughly, identified potential challenges they might face, and prepared thoughtful questions that demonstrated his value. The negotiation proceeded very differently than their first conversation. Marcus asked for time to review the formal offer, mentioned that he was considering other opportunities, and subtly demonstrated his knowledge of the industry and the company's competitive position. By the end of the meeting, David had increased both the salary and equity portions of the offer. Marcus still didn't accept immediately. He thanked David for the improved offer and promised a decision within 48 hours. This delay served multiple purposes. It maintained his position of strength, gave him time to truly evaluate whether this opportunity aligned with his long-term goals, and allowed him to potentially create additional leverage. That night, as Marcus reviewed his journal entries from the past month, he was amazed by how much his thinking had evolved. The desperate, reactive person who had started this journey was being replaced by someone more thoughtful, strategic, and resilient. He was learning to play a longer game, to think several moves ahead, and to maintain emotional equilibrium regardless of external circumstances. The transformation was far from complete, but Marcus could feel himself becoming the type of person he had always admired. Someone who created opportunities rather than waiting for them, who remained calm under pressure, and who approached challenges with strategic thinking rather than emotional reaction. More importantly, he was beginning to understand that true strength wasn't about never experiencing setbacks or difficulties. It was about developing the skills and mindset to navigate those challenges effectively, to learn from them, and to emerge stronger on the other side. 2 months into his transformation, Marcus faced a crisis that would test everything he had learned. His father called with devastating news. The family construction business that had been operating for 3 generations was on the verge of bankruptcy. His father, a proud man who had worked 18-hour days for 40 years, was asking Marcus to come home and help save what remained of their legacy. The old Marcus would have immediately quit everything and rushed home, driven by guilt, family obligation, and emotional impulse. But the person he was becoming understood that good intentions without strategic thinking often led to poor outcomes for everyone involved. Before making any decisions, Marcus spent 3 days researching the construction industry, analyzing the company's financial records, and developing a comprehensive understanding of the challenges they faced. The situation was worse than his father had admitted. The business owed nearly $200,000 to suppliers and contractors. Competition from larger firms had eroded their market share, and they had been underbidding jobs just to keep workers employed, essentially bleeding money on every project. Most concerning was that his father had been making decisions based on emotional attachments to long-time employees and traditional ways of doing business, rather than adapting to changing market realities. Marcus realized this was exactly the type of situation Machiavelli had written about, where good intentions and emotional decision-making could lead to the destruction of everything you were trying to protect. If he simply injected his remaining savings into the business without addressing the fundamental problems, he would only delay the inevitable collapse while destroying his own financial stability. Instead, Marcus approached the situation with the strategic thinking he had been developing. He spent a week at home, not as the desperate son coming to rescue the family business, but as a consultant analyzing a complex problem. He interviewed employees, reviewed contracts, studied their competitors, and identified the core issues that needed to be addressed. His analysis revealed that the business could potentially be saved, but it would require difficult decisions that his father was emotionally unable to make. They needed to lay off nearly half their workforce, renegotiate supplier agreements, focus on higher-margin commercial projects, and implement modern project management systems. Most painfully, they needed to let go of unprofitable long-time customers who had been given favorable pricing out of personal relationships rather than business logic. When Marcus presented his findings to his father, the conversation was one of the most difficult of his life. His father initially reacted with anger, accusing Marcus of being cold and calculating, of not understanding the value of loyalty and tradition. But Marcus had learned to separate emotional reactions from underlying concerns. His father wasn't really angry about the business recommendations. He was afraid of admitting that his way of doing things had failed, and he was terrified of disappointing people who had depended on him for years. Understanding this deeper concern, Marcus was able to address his father's real fears rather than just defending his recommendations. He acknowledged the difficulty of the decisions they faced and the genuine care his father had for his employees. But he also helped his father understand that continuing on the current path would ultimately hurt more people than making difficult changes now. Marcus offered a compromise that demonstrated the strategic thinking he had developed. Rather than his father implementing these changes alone, Marcus would take a leave of absence from his job search and work full-time for 3 months to help execute the turnaround plan. This would allow his father to maintain relationships while Marcus made the difficult decisions, and it would give Marcus hands-on experience in crisis management and business turnaround. The 3 months that followed were intense and educational. Marcus discovered that implementing strategic plans in the real world was far more complex than developing them on paper. Every decision affected real people with families and mortgages. Long-time suppliers who were cut from contracts had been friends of the family for decades. Employees who were laid off had worked beside Marcus during summer jobs throughout high school. But Marcus also learned that making decisions based on strategic necessity rather than emotional comfort often led to better outcomes for everyone involved. By focusing on higher-margin projects, they were able to pay remaining employees better wages. By improving project management systems, they reduced stress and overtime for their crews. By renegotiating supplier agreements, they created more sustainable relationships that would benefit everyone long-term. The most challenging situation came when Marcus had to fire Tony, a long-time foreman who was beloved by everyone but whose outdated methods were costing the company money on every job. Tony had taught Marcus how to use power tools and had been like an uncle to him growing up. But Marcus had learned to separate personal feelings from business decisions. Instead of simply firing Tony, Marcus spent time understanding his situation and finding creative solutions. He discovered that Tony's real value wasn't in project management, but in his relationships with subcontractors and his knowledge of building techniques. Marcus restructured Tony's role to focus on client relations and quality control, areas where his experience was genuinely valuable. This approach, addressing the underlying issues while finding ways to preserve what was truly valuable, became Marcus's signature method. He learned to see past surface problems to understand root causes and to develop solutions that addressed multiple concerns simultaneously. By the end of the 3 months, the business was not only stable but actually growing. They had secured 2 major commercial contracts, improved their profit margins by 30%, and created a more sustainable operation. More importantly, Marcus had gained invaluable experience in crisis management, difficult decision-making, and the implementation of strategic plans under pressure. When Marcus returned to his own life, he carried with him a new level of confidence and capability. He had proven to himself that he could handle complex, high-pressure situations while maintaining strategic thinking and emotional control. The experience had also taught him the importance of understanding human psychology in implementing change, that the best strategies fail if you don't account for the emotional and psychological factors that drive human behavior. His father, initially resistant to Marcus's methods, had become one of his strongest advocates. He began telling other business owners about his son's approach, which led to several consulting inquiries for Marcus. What had started as a family crisis had become an opportunity to develop new skills and potentially create a new career path. More importantly, Marcus had learned to trust his strategic thinking even in emotionally charged situations. He had discovered that caring about people and making tough decisions weren't mutually exclusive. That sometimes the most caring thing you can do is make the difficult choices that others are unable to make. The experience reinforced one of Machiavelli's key insights. that effective leadership often requires the courage to do what is necessary rather than what is popular or comfortable. Marcus was beginning to understand that true strength came not from avoiding difficult situations, but from developing the skills and emotional resilience to handle them effectively. 6 months after beginning his transformation, Marcus found himself in a position he never could have imagined. The consulting work that had emerged from helping his father had grown into a steady stream of small business turnaround projects. His reputation for combining strategic thinking with practical implementation was spreading through word-of-mouth recommendations. But success brought new challenges that would test his evolving philosophy in unexpected ways. The most significant test came when Rachel Morrison, the CEO of a mid-sized technology company, contacted him about a complex organizational crisis. Her company was bleeding talent, missing deadlines, and facing potential acquisition by a larger competitor, not as a success story, but as a distressed asset. The situation was complicated by the fact that Rachel and Marcus had briefly dated in college, and their relationship had ended badly when Marcus had chosen career opportunities over their relationship. The old Marcus would have either avoided the situation entirely due to personal discomfort or accepted it for the wrong reasons, perhaps hoping to prove something to Rachel or to revisit old feelings. But the strategic thinker he had become approached the situation differently. He analyzed whether he was genuinely the best person to help with the company's problems, whether the project aligned with his professional goals, and whether he could maintain appropriate professional boundaries. After careful consideration, Marcus agreed to take on the project, but he established clear parameters from the beginning. He would work directly with the executive team, but report to the board of directors, ensuring accountability beyond his personal relationship with Rachel. He also insisted on a defined timeline and specific success metrics, creating professional structure that would prevent personal issues from interfering with business objectives. The company's problems were more complex than Marcus had initially understood. The surface issues, missed deadlines, and departing employees were symptoms of deeper cultural and strategic problems. The company had grown rapidly without developing appropriate management systems. Key decisions were made informally by a small group of founders who had been friends since college, creating confusion about roles and responsibilities. Most damaging was that the company culture still operated like a startup despite having over 200 employees, leading to burnout and frustration among staff who needed more structure and clarity. Marcus spent his first 2 weeks conducting interviews with employees at every level of the organization. What he discovered was a classic case of successful people who had never learned to scale their success. The founders were still trying to personally oversee every decision, creating bottlenecks that slowed progress and frustrated talented employees who felt micromanaged. The situation required Marcus to apply everything he had learned about implementing change in complex human systems. He couldn't simply recommend structural changes. He had to understand the psychological and political dynamics that were maintaining the current dysfunction. The founders genuinely cared about their employees and were afraid that implementing more formal systems would destroy the collaborative culture they valued. They were also afraid of losing control over a company they had built from nothing. Marcus realized that his approach needed to address these fears while gradually introducing the systems and structure the company needed. He began by working with individual founders to help them understand that their reluctance to delegate wasn't protecting the company culture, it was destroying it. Talented employees were leaving because they felt their skills weren't being utilized, not because they wanted less responsibility. The breakthrough came when Marcus suggested a pilot program in one department. Instead of implementing company-wide changes that felt threatening to the founders, he proposed testing new management approaches in the marketing department, which was experiencing the most severe problems. This allowed them to see results without committing to changes throughout the entire organization. The pilot program involved establishing clear roles and responsibilities, implementing regular feedback systems, and giving department managers actual authority to make decisions within defined parameters. Most importantly, Marcus helped the founders understand that delegation didn't mean loss of control. It meant creating systems that would keep them informed while allowing the company to operate more efficiently. The results were dramatic. Within 6 weeks, the marketing department had improved productivity by 40%, employee satisfaction scores had increased significantly, and they had successfully launched a product campaign that had been delayed for months. More importantly for the founders, they discovered that having clear systems actually gave them better visibility into what was happening in their company, not less. But the real test of Marcus's development came when Rachel tried to make the situation personal. During what was supposed to be a professional progress meeting, she brought up their college relationship and suggested that working together again felt like destiny. She implied that perhaps they had both needed to grow and develop before they could have a real relationship. The old Marcus might have been flattered or confused by this development. He might have wondered if she was right about destiny, or worried about whether personal feelings would affect his professional judgment. But the person he had become understood that this was exactly the type of situation Machiavelli had written about, where personal desires could undermine professional objectives and long-term strategic thinking. Marcus responded with the emotional control and strategic clarity he had developed. He acknowledged their history honestly, but redirected the conversation to professional boundaries. He explained that maintaining those boundaries wasn't about rejecting her personally, but about ensuring that he could provide the best possible service to her company. He also made it clear that attempting to blur professional and personal lines would compromise his ability to help the organization. Rachel's reaction revealed important insights about human nature that Marcus filed away for future reference. Initially, she seemed hurt and perhaps angry that he wasn't responding to her overture. But within days, her professional respect for him had increased noticeably. She began including him in higher-level strategic discussions and seeking his input on decisions beyond the original scope of his consulting work. Marcus realized that by maintaining professional boundaries, he had actually increased his influence and effectiveness. Rachel and her team trusted him more because they understood that his recommendations weren't influenced by personal agendas. This reinforced one of Machiavelli's key insights about the relationship between respect and influence, that people often respect most those who maintain their principles under pressure. As the 3-month consulting project neared completion, the company had undergone a remarkable transformation. Employee retention had improved dramatically. Project completion rates had increased by 60%, and they had successfully negotiated a strategic partnership with the company that had previously been considering acquiring them as a distressed asset. But perhaps the most significant change was in the founders themselves. They had learned to think more strategically about organizational development and were actively working to build systems that would support continued growth. They had also begun to see their role differently, not as controllers of every decision, but as leaders who created environments where talented people could do their best work. The success of this project led to several new consulting opportunities, including an offer to join a management consulting firm as a partner. Marcus had to decide whether to continue building his independent practice or accept the security and resources of joining an established firm. It was exactly the type of strategic decision that would have paralyzed him a year earlier. Instead, he approached the decision with the systematic thinking he had developed. He analyzed the pros and cons of each option, considered how they aligned with his long-term goals, and evaluated what each path would require of him personally and professionally. Most importantly, he made the decision based on strategic considerations rather than emotional impulses or short-term comfort. Marcus chose to continue building his independent practice, but he negotiated a collaboration agreement with the consulting firm that would give him access to their resources and expertise while maintaining his autonomy. It was a creative solution that addressed multiple objectives simultaneously, exactly the type of strategic thinking that had become his signature approach. 1 year after his transformation began, Marcus stood in his new office overlooking the city skyline, reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. His consulting practice had grown beyond his most optimistic projections, with a waiting list of companies seeking his expertise in organizational turnarounds and strategic development. But the external success, impressive as it was, paled in comparison to the internal transformation he had undergone. The ultimate test of his development came when Sarah contacted him unexpectedly. She had heard about his professional success through mutual friends and wanted to meet for dinner. Her message was carefully crafted to seem casual, but Marcus could read between the lines. She was curious about the changes in him and perhaps reconsidering their relationship. The old Marcus would have been either immediately eager or completely resistant, driven by unprocessed emotions from their breakup. But the person he had become approached her request with the same strategic thinking he applied to professional situations. He considered what he truly wanted from the interaction, what Sarah's motivations might be, and how meeting with her aligned with his current life goals. Marcus agreed to dinner, but he prepared for it like any important meeting. He clarified his own objectives, to maintain friendly relations with someone who had been important in his life, while avoiding the emotional confusion that had characterized their previous relationship. He also anticipated various directions the conversation might take and considered how he would respond to each scenario. The dinner was a revelation. Sarah had clearly expected to encounter either the desperate man she had left or someone trying to impress her with his newfound success. Instead, she found someone who was genuinely interested in her life and experiences, but wasn't seeking her approval or validation. Marcus listened attentively to her stories about work and travel, asked thoughtful questions, and shared updates about his own life without trying to prove anything. As the evening progressed, Sarah's behavior became increasingly puzzling to Marcus. She seemed almost frustrated by his calm confidence and lack of neediness. She made several comments about how different he seemed, and her questions became more probing, as if she were trying to find some crack in his composure or some sign of the emotional reactivity she remembered. Marcus realized that Sarah was experiencing what many people feel when someone they knew well undergoes significant personal development, a mixture of attraction to the positive changes and discomfort with the unfamiliarity of the new version. She had been attracted to his confidence and drive when they first met, but during their relationship, she had grown accustomed to his neediness and emotional volatility. Now that he had reclaimed his confidence without the accompanying neediness, she didn't quite know how to relate to him. When Sarah suggested they go back to her place to continue talking, Marcus recognized it as a test of his emotional control and strategic thinking. The old Marcus might have interpreted this as a sign that she wanted to reconcile, or he might have agreed out of loneliness or physical desire. But he understood that acting on impulse would be inconsistent with the person he had worked hard to become. Marcus thanked her for the evening and declined her invitation politely but firmly. He explained that he valued their history and wanted to maintain a positive relationship, but he was focused on building something new in his life and wasn't interested in revisiting the past. His response was honest but not harsh, confident but not arrogant. Sarah's reaction confirmed the wisdom of his approach. Initially surprised by his response, she quickly shifted to respect for his clarity and self-control. They parted on genuinely friendly terms, and Marcus felt satisfied that he had handled a complex situation with integrity and strategic thinking. The interaction with Sarah highlighted how completely his approach to relationships had changed. He no longer saw relationships as something that happened to him or as sources of validation for his worth as a person. Instead, he approached them as conscious choices that should align with his values and long-term objectives. This didn't make him cold or calculating in his personal life. Rather, it made him more intentional and authentic in his connections with others. This new approach to relationships extended beyond romantic situations. Marcus had learned to build professional networks strategically, not through manipulation or false friendships, but by genuinely providing value to others and maintaining relationships over time. He stayed in touch with former clients, made introductions when he could help people, and gradually built a reputation as someone who could be trusted to deliver results and maintain confidentiality. The strategic thinking that had saved his career also transformed his approach to personal development. Marcus continued studying, but now he focused on areas that would compound over time: psychology, negotiation, leadership theory, and industry-specific expertise. He maintained his physical fitness not just for health, but because he understood the connection between physical and mental resilience. Perhaps most importantly, Marcus had learned to manage his emotional state consciously rather than being at the mercy of external circumstances. When setbacks occurred, and they still did, he had developed systems for processing them constructively rather than being derailed by them. He would analyze what went wrong, extract lessons for future situations, and adjust his approach accordingly. This emotional resilience was tested when one of his largest clients terminated their contract unexpectedly due to budget cuts. The old Marcus would have panicked about the lost revenue and taken the cancellation personally. Instead, he used the situation as an opportunity to evaluate his business model and reduce his dependence on any single client. He also reached out to contacts in his network and within 2 weeks had identified 3 new potential projects. Marcus's transformation extended beyond professional success to encompass a fundamental shift in how he saw himself and his place in the world. He no longer felt like someone to whom things happened. He felt like someone who created his own circumstances through strategic thinking and consistent action. This sense of agency had become the foundation of his confidence and resilience. Looking back on his journey, Marcus could see that the transformation hadn't been about becoming a different person so much as it had been about becoming the best version of himself. The confidence and drive had always been there, but they had been buried under emotional reactivity, poor decision-making, and a lack of strategic thinking. Machiavelli's teachings had provided a framework for uncovering and developing those latent qualities. The man who now stood in the corner office was still recognizably the same person who had stared at himself in the bathroom mirror 18 months earlier, but he had been refined and strengthened by deliberate practice and strategic thinking. He had learned to be both the lion and the fox that Machiavelli had written about, strong when strength was needed, subtle when subtlety was required, and wise enough to know the difference. Marcus understood that his transformation was ongoing rather than complete. Each new challenge provided opportunities to refine his strategic thinking and emotional control. But he now had confidence in his ability to handle whatever situations arose, because he had developed the skills and mindset to approach problems systematically rather than reactively. Most importantly, he had learned that true strength came not from never experiencing difficulties, but from developing the capability to navigate them effectively. The setbacks and failures that had once seemed like evidence of his inadequacy had become stepping stones toward a more resilient and capable version of himself. As Marcus prepared for his next client meeting, he smiled at the reflection in his office window. The man looking back at him was calm, confident, and ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. He had successfully reforged himself into someone tougher, calmer, and more calculated, not through becoming cold or manipulative, but through developing genuine strength, strategic thinking, and emotional resilience. The Machiavelli method had given him more than professional success. It had given him the tools to create the life he truly wanted and the confidence to maintain it regardless of external circumstances.